Hello, dear students. This is Gilles Tellier for our last lecture on British international politics and the Empire. I hope you enjoyed my introduction. Maybe you heard some of the lyrics of this song, which is a bit pompous, of course. It is Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never shall be slaves, which is a famous song from the imperial period, which is still sung, even was recently sung by some British politicians. So this introduction in music to let you know what we are going to do, and of course the song will be mentioned in a few minutes in our slides, and so now you will be able to say that you have heard it. Of course you can go on the internet to listen to the whole song and to see the videos that go with it, which is quite nice. So the last of the 6 chapters on the Victorian era and the 19th century period ends our program on the 19th century, and from next week on you will be working for 6 weeks on the 20th and 21st century. So now you are used to how we work. This audio goes with the PowerPoint. I've heard that some students complain that 2 hours of concentration is too long. Well, don't worry, you are well aware that you can stop a recording and have a break and then start again. So don't hesitate to do that. Concentration is a quality that is important for a student. So the first slide of lecture number 6 is, of course, the presentation of our course. So I'm just going to go directly to slide number 2, and with the title of today's lecture, 1885, Death in Khartoum. So you can see maybe with this title that the lecture is going to be a bit gory because it deals with the death of one person. But of course we will talk of many deaths because we'll talk about the British Empire in particular. The perspectives: Rule Britannia, that's the song you've just heard, and it's a motto, it's a slogan, it's something that was repeated, and we'll talk about it. From the sepoys to the Boers, which are people that were conquered by the British. Imperial and diplomatic history, scramble for Africa, foreign affairs, and splendid isolation. All these words are important. We will mention them in the course of our presentation. Slide number 3, we are going to go into the details of our lecture, and to be more precise on the date of the event, which is at the heart of our lecture. January 26, 1885, the death in Khartoum in Sudan of General Charles Gordon Pasha. Pasha is his nickname. It's Charles Gordon. So it's British international and imperial policies to begin with, and British foreign affairs, and a question as a second part: why Greater Britain? And of course we're going to explain what is Greater Britain by opposition to Little England. So to start with, slide number 4, British foreign affairs. You know how we work. We start with a background you must know, and in the second part, an influential nation. Slide number 5, the background you must know. As usual, you do remember that we need to go back in time so that you can have the key elements to understand the 19th century situation. And of course you know that this program will be developed next year for you. So once again we need a little bit of landmarking. So slide number 6 is an important one. I already mentioned the date. Now you have a few pictures. It's the glorious revolution of 1688 and its aftermath, its consequences. We mentioned the fact that there was a fight a regular fight, I would say, between parliament and monarchy for eternity, I would say. Of course, because very often parliament was composed of noble people, and some of them did not agree with the king or the queen, but also some of them wanted to become king. And therefore there were a lot of tensions. And of course, when Parliament developed, this is last week's lecture, you should of course have read it and understood it in order to understand what we're saying today. Parliament, little by little, took strength and decided that it was enough with some of the kings of England, particularly those we see on the picture who are kings who originated from Scotland. You remember the successor of Queen Elizabeth I was James VI of Scotland, and he became James I of England because Queen Elizabeth did not have any heir, any children to access the throne. And he was a Stuart king. James Stuart was his name. We mentioned the fact that the Stuarts were not very popular, and therefore they were not popular in Parliament, at least, because they governed by divine right. That is, they considered that Parliament was useless, and they didn't summon Parliament in order to ask for pieces of advice. So they would decide everything without the consent of Parliament. And until the day that there was a bloodless revolution, as you can see on the little sticker on this slide, or the Glorious Revolution. Bloodless because there was no fighting, in fact. The Parliament went to fetch a pretendant to the throne who was from the Netherlands, William of Orange, and this Dutch king was asked to come to London, and the Stuart dynasty was stopped, and as a consequence, a Dutch king became King of England. And mind you, these are some of the there are interesting anecdotes, such as the fact that if you ask people when you say that English people say either or, ou bien ou, and the Americans say either or, the question would be who has the original pronunciation. And very often people say it's the English, of course. And in fact, no, it's not. It's the Americans. It's because they took the original pronunciation to the United States with the Pilgrim Fathers, remember? And the original pronunciation in English is either. Why is it pronounced either then today in England? Because that king came from the Netherlands. He had a guttural pronunciation. He couldn't really pronounce the way the English did, and so he said either with a strong Dutch accent. And of course, then everybody started to imitate the king because it was fashionable, and everybody started saying either. This is why there was a change of pronunciation. This is just an anecdote, but anyway, it's always nice to have anecdotes. After that, some Stuart kings, particularly the one you see on the picture, whose name was Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was a prince, he was not a king, because there were no Stuart kings anymore in England. He wanted to take his throne back, so he went to Scotland, where he had people who still supported him, particularly the Highlanders, you know, the Scottish people with the kilts, the one who lived in the northern part of Scotland, the Highlands, by opposition to the Lowlands, who are close to England. These Highlanders were Catholics, and therefore they supported the Stuart pretender, because the Stuarts had become Catholic kings. This is why it did not please the Parliament, who was Protestant, and this is why they went to fetch a Dutch Protestant king, whose title is William of Orange, because in fact in the Netherlands they were also princes of Orange, and in fact this city is not far from where we live. It's in the Vaucluse, it's Orange, and it used to be a Protestant stronghold. This is why the kings of the Netherlands were Princes of Orange, and William of Orange brought this title to England. And mind you, this is why there is an Order of Orange in Ulster, for example. So Bonnie Prince Charlie came to Britain and took the Highlanders with him, and there was a rebellion. It's what's called the Jacobite Rebellion or Uprising in 1745. Jacobite because of James. James gives the name of Jacobite. The Jacobite Rebellion nearly succeeded. The Highlanders nearly took London, but they failed to take London, and they came back to Scotland. They were pressed by a British army, you know, with the red coats, and they were defeated at the Battle of Culloden. It's a famous battlefield in Scotland where the Highlanders were massacred by the British troops. And this was really the end of the instability in Britain. The Great Jacobite Rebellion was really the last important civil war that took place in the British Isles. And from then on, it was also the time of the starting of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, in the 1740s, 1750s, 1760s, the Industrial Revolution unfolded, and as a consequence of the new stability that was present in Britain, there was a population growth, and as a consequence also an economic boom in Britain, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and thanks to peace and stability in Britain. And for the first time, Britain could secure its boundaries, and the government started to think otherwise. That is, they didn't want just to take care of the British Isles, but they started thinking about having an influence first in Europe and maybe later in the world. And this is why this Jacobite rebellion was an important landmark. Slide number 7, we are talking about international policy. Britain started to become interested in the rest of the world. Of course, they already had colonies in the United States, and they had been there for a long time. Not the United States, sorry, I mean in America. The United States did not exist yet. It was the 13 colonies on the eastern coast of what is now the United States, and of course a great part of Canada. And so this is what is called the first British Empire. You can see a nice map with a few patches, red patches, not to compare to the second British Empire, which will be of course much bigger. But this empire is already quite big if you look at Canada and part of America. And you can see also that there are patches in Indonesia and in India, which will become one of the most important colony in British Empire, but that will be a few years later. So you see this map is really the starting point for Britain of its international policy. And this policy was possible for one important thing, which we will come back on, is that Britain force was not just the army, but mainly the navy. Its military ships were really the force of Great Britain. Of course, Britain was not the only maritime power of that time. There were others, such as the Dutch, for example, the Spanish, the Portuguese, even the French were present on the seas. But Britain, being Great Britain, being composed of islands, really developed a strong interest in seafare, and therefore developed a big war navy, or navy. Navy includes the word of war inside. So we go to slide number 8, and this is the time that when France and Britain are going to clash in not in Europe, not directly, although they are very close, You just have the channel to cross, but it's not in Europe that they're going to clash, but in their own colonies. So you had what is called the 7 Years' War from 1754 to 1763, and at the end France lost that war, and in the Paris Treaty in 1763, France lost a lot of its possession that were given to Britain as a reward of the treaty. So you see, Britain took over Canada, and particularly the part known as Quebec. Quebec became English at that time. St. Louis in Senegal, you remember it used to be French. Trading stations in Gambia and Chandelore, which is in Bengal in India, and other French possessions in India. The Caribbean islands, St. Vincent, the Dominic, Grenada and Tobago, etc., etc. Many islands or many, you see, trading stations, des comptoirs, which of course on the military, for a military purpose is not very important, but for a commercial purpose is very important. Of course, you know it's obvious that the army and commerce go well together. Islands, well, because they can trade with islands, but also islands are important for the navy. Islands are easy places to stop ships in harbors, for example. So you will see that a lot of small colonies of the British Empire will be islands such as Saint Helena or Mauritius or Malta in the Mediterranean Sea. All those small places will be British because Britain wants to have refueling stations for its navy. So military purposes and commercial purposes. Slide number 9 is of course also very important because you know it's also part of French history, is the opposition to Napoleon. Napoleon, after the French Revolution was a threat to a lot of monarchies in Europe, so they opposed the French Revolution, but they lost the French War, the First French War, the French Revolution War, at the Battle of Valmy. And you know that in French history, this is a big victory where the French Republic was able to preserve its existence. And after that, Europe started to leave France alone. But things took up when France became led by Napoleon Bonaparte, whom you know well, of course. And Britain was afraid of him because he was a genius in terms of military strategy. You know that he covered nearly all Europe. He invaded all Europe except England. He couldn't finish invading Russia just because it was winter, and of course because the enemies had done a good job in preventing Napoleon from advancing too quick to take Moscow. The Russians will do the same with the Germans during the Second World War. It's a good strategy when winter is your ally, and of course becomes the enemy of your enemy. So he's your friend in a way. So the coalition against Napoleon was led by the British government, and they put a lot of money into the fight. Half of the money of the coalition came from Britain. And if you do remember from previous lectures, we mentioned the fact that there was a recession after Napoleon was defeated in 1815. So that's the economic aspect. However, Britain, even if it cost Britain a lot of money, a lot of men who died in front of Napoleon, it also enabled Britain to become a leader in Europe, because they were the leader of the coalition against Napoleon, and therefore they could boast to have defeated the ogre, as he was nicknamed by the British, that is Napoleon Bonaparte. And of course, the Paris Treaty, once again, in 1815, gave a lot of other possessions to Britain, but what is more important, it gave Britain some prestige, and therefore Britain was able to have an international influence over many countries. And this was what Britain had expected for long, because Britain had never led the world. So this is the background that was important to mention. So the second part on the political international affairs of Britain, that's slide number 10, 1b, an influential nation. Now you understand how Britain became influential. Now the first question to be asked is alliances or splendid isolation? This expression is an important one, because the idea is that some people considered that Britain should be alone, because the problem when you have an ally, if you are attacked, you can ask your ally to help you. This is positive. But if your ally is attacked, you also have to side with the ally, which means that you can be always in war, because many of your allies may be at war. So it's always a danger to have allies. However, this splendid isolation that was coined, that means invented, by Canadian Finance Minister George Euless Foster in 1896, even though it was famous, it was not totally true. We will see that in fact Britain had always allies from time to time, not always the same people, but they always took the opportunity to have friends in order to be more efficient and to be more powerful. So splendid isolation it was not a reality at the time, and alliances, which is a normal traditional political activity to find alliances, became very important. This also, of course, in that matter, Britain seemed to be a very successful nation in terms of expansion, in terms of alliances, and in terms of power. There was one drawback, of course, from this positive portrait, which was the loss of the United States of America, or the loss, rather, I should say, of the American colonies, not in Canada, but in what will become the United States of America. Remember the independence of the United States of America, 1776. But there will be further fighting until the final treaty, the Versailles Treaty in 1783, where the Americans will have their independence from Britain and will become an autonomous country. So even if it's a drawback from Britain, Britain has always been a very pragmatic nation. And instead of considering the Americans as their enemies because they had kicked them out of their country, Britain say, hey, come on, let's not fight. We are from the same blood, we speak the same language, we have the same religion, and therefore maybe we should stay allies. And this is the beginning of the sphere of influence of Britain and America. And the idea that Americans and British have a common origin, have common ground, have common blood, and therefore should remain friends. And of course, on a economic basis, someone like Adam Smith said, well, it's not a problem to lose the American colonies, because as long as we continue to have privileged relations with them, and we continue to have the possibility to trade with them. And the positive aspect is that we do not have to pay for the colony. The colony cost a lot of money, but now they're autonomous, so we just have to trade. But of course we need special trading contracts with them, and that's what they did. This is why America, the United States of America, and Britain have remained good friends even just after the end of their relation, I would say, as a colony and the mother country. slide number 12 is about those alliances that I mentioned. You have a map of Europe. Of course, you see the privileged position of Britain, which is that with any ship they can go anywhere they want, anywhere in Europe, including inside the Mediterranean Sea. They just have to cross the Strait of Gibraltar and they can have an influence in the Mediterranean Sea, and they will have this influence. An important element which is remarkable in British political policies is that when Napoleon was defeated, a lot of countries wanted France to be punished and to pay tribute to reimburse, in fact, what the nations had paid to fight Napoleon. But the British government opposed that, particularly, as you see, Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh, because the idea of humiliating a country is a bad idea, because it's then that nationalism in the country will rise again in order to get revenge from this humiliation. And he was absolutely right, because we have the proof that when Britain said to France, no, we must not humiliate Germany after its defeat in 1918, we must not humiliate her because she's going to rise up and want revenge. And unfortunately, Britain this time was not listened to, and France and other countries punished Germany. And of course, this was a favorable field for Adolf Hitler and his nationalism to raise Germany again, and of course to start the Second World War. So these are important aspects of international policy. You will see that the influence of Britain goes all the way to Turkey, which at the time was called the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was sometimes an ally to Britain and sometimes an enemy. We will see why. Other enemies or potential enemies would be the Prussians, of course, which was not yet Germany. It was called Prussia. Austria, which was not the same size as it is today, but existed already. And Russia, of course, was part of the deal. So Britain had alliances with different countries. Not France immediately, but we will see that before the definite alliance with France, which will take place in 1904, there was another alliance before in the Crimean War, which is an interesting topic. I saw 2 days ago on television a report when they found the graves of French soldiers in Crimea that archaeologists found. So the Crimean War is still present in our memory. To carry on our reflection on British international policy and the new power that Britain is developing, the new diplomatic power, not just military, I'd like to go on to my slide number 13 and to talk about the power of the foreign secretaries. These British foreign secretary, most of them were quite efficient and influential, and so influential that many of them became later prime ministers. So you see, they were charismatic, intelligent, and they had a project for their country. So this is thanks to their personality that Britain was able to develop in the 19th century and to develop its empire, which we will talk about in the second part of this lecture. One example among many others is Lord George Canning. You can see his portrait, and you can see that so his dates are 1770, 1827. That's when he was born and he died. And what is interesting is he was foreign secretary from 1822 to 1827, And then he became prime minister in 1827. You see, following his mandate as a foreign secretary, he became prime minister. Unfortunately, you can see there is a coincidence between his death and his becoming a prime minister. He was a bit too old, I suppose. Yeah. This example is interesting. He was a liberal, so now you know what a liberal is, by opposition to a conservative. Okay, and so he favored free trade, and this is, of course, one of the key issues of this the development of Britain, of its policy and its commerce and its military activity. It's because, of course, when you're a liberal, you want to expand in order to find new markets, and you want your products to be able to be exported. And this is why there are political activity with the rest of the world, so that and you know that because today when the president of France goes to a country, he takes with him a lot of industrialists and people that are going to be able to sell some products to the country with whom France is going to have a contract or an alliance. And this has always been done. That is, politics and commerce have always gone hand in hand. He also wanted to, as I said, to be careful not to have to send its army into countries where he had no interest. So this is why he was cautious with alliances, because once again, as I said, and you do understand the logic, if you are you have an ally, sorry, you must help him in case of danger for him. So, for example, this is why he didn't intervene when France went into Spain to have an influence on the succession in Spain, and he also prevented the French Navy from going to South America in order to preserve the American economic market, the South American economic market. And this is what is called the informal empire. The informal empire is not the real geographical, physical empire, but just an empire where the country has an influence, and more particularly an economic influence. So by preventing French people, French traders to go to South America, he preserved South America for British traders. And of course, this is how people get rich, when they have a sort of monopoly. Of course, Britain and France were in competition, so we can imagine this was an important issue for foreign secretaries. So this is very often why a foreign secretary who had a great aura, he was famous for his performances as a foreign secretary, would then become a prime minister. I mentioned the Crimean War. This is one of the cases where an alliance between France and Britain took place. Very few alliances between France and Britain until then, but this time there was a sphere of influence on the Crimean. And Crimea was, as you know, is a bone of contention between Russia and other countries. And a few years ago, Mr. Putin, president of Russia, invaded Crimea, which was not a Russian territory. It used to be a Russian territory, but it was not anymore. And so he took it by force, and therefore now Crimea is Russian again. At that time, you can see that Crimea was Russian already. But it was taken by France and England as allies, and this is why in Paris you have memories of that event with tube stations that are called Sebastopol or Malakoff, are famous battles from the Crimean War, and that the statue of the Zouave from the Pont de l'Alma is a reminder of this war also. So this, of course, was um, um, an example where Britain was drawn into its alliance with France to intervene military. And this is, of course, part of what we can call the chess game of on the European exchequer. That is, you play a game and with pawns, and you try to gain advantage over an enemy. Another example is the gentleman you see on my slide number 14, Lord Palmerston. He also became Prime Minister in 1855, so as I said, a lot of foreign secretaries became Prime Minister, and he served 20 years as a foreign secretary. So you can imagine the knowledge he had of international affairs, and of course when he became Prime Minister, it was easy for him to continue in that pattern. At that time, it's interesting to see that the enemies were not the enemies of today, and friends became enemies, and enemies became friends. Things changed a lot, and it's surprising the situation in the beginning of the 20th century when you see how things happened in the 19th century. France and Russia were opponents. Britain sided with France. The Turkish Empire was also sometimes an ally and sometimes an opponent. And this game, we could say, even though it's not a funny game because people died during those periods because of the little wars that were taking place, but this game could be endless, and fortunately we will see that things will settle, particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, as it will become how should I put it? It will become what is going to come next. That is, it's going to become the allies are going to stay allies, sorry, and the enemies will be on the other side, and this will shape the 20th century, particularly during two world wars. So to slide number 15, a very important landmark also in international affairs are the European revolutions. They took place at the same time. Britain didn't have a revolution at that time. It nearly had one. It was called the Chartist movement, you remember? There was nearly a revolution coming from the basis, from the working class people. The Chartist movement, fortunately for the elite and for the government in Britain, the Chartist movement had dissensions inside its ranks, and as a consequence, the movement collapsed. Sorry, I'm tired. And therefore, there was no revolution in Britain. However, it was close. There were other revolutions. The German nationalism, for example, there was a unity of the different German territories, led by one which is famous. I mentioned it already, was Prussia, but there were other parts that became united little by little. And Germany was seen as a positive thing for England, so England supported Germany because it was seen as a counter force against France and Russia. Okay, that is, if there was a war between Britain against France and against Russia, then Germany could play a part to defend England. And of course, in order to have a powerful Germany, it meant having a weakened Austria, because Austria as a big Germanic country and Germany as a big Germanic country was too much. It was not possible. For the balance, you see, it's sort of, once again, it's a game. This is a political game, which is, of course, is not finished. This is why a lot of little countries had an importance, such as Hungary or the Balkans. which were far from England, but they had an influence because they had to they so there was a sort of domino game. That is, if you started touching at one country, you had to touch many other countries. And this is what was going to happen in the First World War because of something that happened in Sarajevo. The whole world will be at war. This is because of the alliances that were developed in the 19th century. And of course, we can see the beginning of this movement in the 19th century. Document 16, slide 16, sorry, is a reminder also of some parts of Europe as they were developed, just to show a close-up on one little area, which is unfortunately famous today because there were floods just a few days ago. It's in between Italy and France, and it's when Napoleon III obtained Nice and the Savoy in 1860 from Sardinia, and the Italians became united under Garibaldi. For Britain, it was important to have a strong Italy to be able to counterbalance France. So Britain supported the Italian unity. Once again, for Britain, the arch enemy, the number one enemy, has always been France. So obviously, to see Napoleon gaining some territories was a bit frightening, and so as a consequence, Britain supported Garibaldi, who was received in London, who was the leader of the unity of the Italian unity, and this is why. Once again, you can see it is a game played by different nations. If we continue, we reach on now this famous song, Rule Britannia, that I have mentioned. Well, not mentioned, sorry. I made you listen to at the beginning. And this Rule Britannia, you can see with the iconographic element, the lion, the British lion, with Britannia dressed as a Greek goddess, and with the Union Jack, of course. She's always present with the Union Jack, and the Greek helmet, because she's a fighter. So that's Britannia, and she is supposed to rule the waves. And there's a little anecdote which I think is always revealing. As you can see at the bottom left-hand corner of your slide, the text goes, Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves. This is the original lyrics, and it's an injunction, it's an order. Britannia, you must rule the waves. Okay? Now, some nationalists, or jingoists as they were known, didn't sing the same lyrics. They just added an S to the word rule. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. And so it's not an injunction, it's not you must rule the waves, which means it's not done yet. When you say Britannia rules the waves, it's a fact. Britannia is already ruling the waves. So this is an interesting anecdote, just an S that changes the whole philosophy of this song and this motto. Now, why do we use that? Because that was something very present in the 19th century. The idea for British foreign affairs was the importance was to rule the waves. That is, to be the best, to have the best navy in the world, because then Britain could intervene anywhere in the world. They could send troops anywhere in the world. This is like what the Romans did in their empire. You know what was their objective? Was to build roads. This is why we have in French un travail de Romain, because it was a huge work to make roads. Why do you make roads? Because then you can transport troops. Troops can walk very easily from one point to the other. So having sea routes or roads on the land is a way to control your empire. And this is why to rule the waves became very fashionable at that time. In 1870, you know, there was a Franco-Prussian war in France, which led to the loss of Alsace and Lorraine, and which will lead to the First World War, because French people will want to take back Alsace and Lorraine. And Britain thought it was a good idea not to intervene and even to support Prussia. You see, it wasn't yet completely Germany, it was still the Prussians. But anyway, it was really German nationalism with Otto von Bismarck. You know, you see the picture and you recognize the face. You've studied that in Lycée probably. He was this leader of the German nationalism. What Britain had not anticipated, that with a strong Germany, they might have problems too. And of course, during the First World War, they will fight against Germany and not against France. But of course, this is not something they could really easily foresee. Slide number 18, just to show you that sometimes the difficulties of a prime minister or a foreign secretary was to know whether to intervene or not in a country. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was still very powerful. The Ottoman Empire disappeared at the end of the First World War, but it was a huge empire, and they were still in the progress of expanding. And so they attacked Bulgarians in 1875, which provoked a huge outcry, just like what happened in Syria today. But of course, the idea was to know, must we stop the Ottomans or not? Just like the question was raised, must we stop the war in Syria or not? You see exactly the same pattern. And so the fact that the Ottoman Empire was seen as the aggressor led other countries to consider the Ottoman Empire as a danger and therefore as an enemy. And because a lot of countries went away from the Ottoman Empire, other countries got closer to with each other in order to make an alliance against that. But and this is why Turkey, who felt abandoned, became allies with countries like Germany and Austria, who thought maybe the Ottoman Empire was important for them. Of course, if you look at the map of Europe, you will see that it was a good idea for them. And of course, you can have the feeling that this is what will lead to the First World War, because Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, Germany and Austria will be together as allies in the First World War. So you see, all these things took a long time, but dated back from the 19th century, and the will to have an influence in Europe. One important prime minister that that should be mentioned, you have his picture with the man with the beard, Prime Minister Lord Salisbury. He wanted to find no firm alliances, because he was one of those prime ministers who said we mustn't be too stuck with one ally. We must, be free and not to go in the same direction. We must be free to go away from someone. And the fact that France and Russia became allies in 1894 frightened Britain, because they thought maybe that they could then become allies with Germany, and as a consequence, France, Germany and Russia against England would be a very powerful alliance. So Britain was really afraid of these things, and this is why Britain felt a bit isolated, and Salisbury was worried at the end of the 19th century that maybe Britain was losing its influence on the world. And of course, there were new powers emerging, such as the United States of America, who were becoming a very powerful industrialized country after the Second World War. So this is a really a sort of European chess game. Once again, it's the best example we can imagine about this political game. You see, I'm your ally, now I'm your enemy. You betray someone, and then you become ally with someone else, and um, all those alliances and opposition drew the modern map of Europe, of course. Of course, things have changed, particularly since the Second World War. You know that Poland has not the same boundaries, Austria is completely different, etc., etc. Boundaries change very much, and at the time being in Armenia and Karabakh, the fight is going on for a piece of land. So it's a never-ending story. The 19th century Europe saw that. And slide number 19 is also an important landmark, as you can see with this cartoon, which shows an octopus, and the octopus is supposed to be a negative animal there. It's got the face of the Tsar, and so it shows that Russia is a danger for the rest of Europe, and therefore people should become allies. The title is John Bull and His Friends. You all remember John Bull because you saw it in one of the tutorial. It's the middle class allegory of the businessman, the middle class Protestant businessman. His name is John Bull and his friends. So it's England and the rest of Europe against Russia. This was one of the dangers, one of the representations. But sometimes, of course, as it has always happened, even though France and England were getting a little bit closer, things started to go bad when there was the Fashoda problem that took place in 1898. As you can see, it took place in Africa. The French leader was Commandant Marchand. The English leader is not here, but he was Lord Kitchener, you know, the one with the big moustache. Who is represented on the posters of the First World War with his military cap saying, "I want you for the British Army." That general was there. And you can see the French are represented by the green line, the green arrow, and the British are represented by the red arrow. And the British went from Cairo, they wanted to go to the Cape, an expedition with soldiers, just like the French who had made an expedition from Dakar to Djibouti. And as a coincidence, they clashed in a small place in Sudan called Fashoda. And there was nearly a war between them because the two armies stayed there saying, "This is our territory." But they didn't fight, fortunately. They telegraphed to their governments and asked what to do. And the French government yielded. That is, he abandoned. He said to Commandant Marchand, "You go away, you leave the place to the English army." So the English were victor without fighting, and the French were ashamed of what the French government had decided to do. They were very much upset, and this is why at the end of the 19th century, 1898, 99, 1900, there was a strong Anglophobia in France. They were really against the English, up to the point that Queen Victoria, who had come 9 times to the south of France, she had gone on holiday particularly in Nice, but also in Grasse and Cannes and Hyères, sorry. She couldn't go in 1900 in Nice because French people were so much against English people that, of course, the government was afraid that Queen Victoria might have problems. So instead she went to Ireland. It was the last time she went on holiday because the following year in 1901 she died. So you see, Anglophobia at that time was really, really, really very, very strong because of this episode. You will read a quote by Lord Lyndhurst in the speech of the House of Lords to show how Russia is seen as the enemy of Britain. And to finish this first part of today's lecture, that is on international relations, I'd like to finish with the Irish problem that took place at that time. Of course, you know Ireland because you have followed all your previous lectures, particularly the ones on the Great Famine that Mr. Calvini-Lefebvre delivered to you. And so you know that Ireland was considered as a colony, and we saw cartoons, very negative cartoons, where the Irish people, poor people, were compared to monkeys. So you do remember this story, and the idea is that Ireland therefore always wanted to become independent, and this is why there was a project called Home Rule. And Home Rule meaning that the Irish government could rule itself autonomously, independently from London. But as you can see on the map with John Bull, here again John Bull is pulling Ulster from Ireland. Of course, the idea is that Ulster should remain with England, and that's what's going to happen. But in 1922, when Ireland will become independent, really, Southern Ireland, or Eyre, E-I-R-E, and Ulster will remain part of Britain, and which is, of course, you know, a bone of contention in the Brexit project, because now there's going to be a border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and that's what the Irish did not want. However, you know that 1 million Irish people died of famine, and you can see with the image at the bottom that 1 million Irish people left for the colonies and America in order to find a new living. So Ireland was something that has been a thorn in the side of the British government. In English, you know, we say une épine dans le côté, whereas in French we say une épine dans le pied. So a thorn in the side. But it means it's been a long problem, long difficulties, and of course this to add to the problem there is this the religious problem, Protestants and Catholics. You have a little box which reminds you where the Union Jack comes from, and therefore it gives you an idea, and it's a way to remember where are the different flags that compose the Union Jack. So one important figure in this international crisis between Britain and Ireland is Daniel O'Connell. Of course, you can see his name, with his name that he's Irish. He became a leader, and he was really one of the opponents of Britain, and one who promoted Home Rule. The rest of the story of Ireland you will learn in the following program on the 20th century, because you heard I told you that they will get only their independence, or part of them will get their independence in 1922. Now, so for those who are tired, I recommend a break. I'm going to continue, but you can just stop listening to this audio and then take up again. We're going to go to the second part now, slide 21, which is a question: why Greater Britain? And as usual, we have to work on the background that you must know in order to remember what are the different elements that will enable you to understand the situation. And the second part is really about the British Empire, with this famous sentence that says the empire on which the sun never sets, which is really, you know, the sort of slogan that has been used to describe the British Empire. Slide 22, a nice map which is quite famous about the British Empire, and you can see you have much more parts which are drawn in red. You can include Australia this time. You have India, completely India, nothing is French anymore. You have South Africa, and it's not complete yet because there are other parts of Africa which should be there. And you have, of course, Canada, which is really the greatest and biggest territory that belongs to Britain. So like slide 23, it's just the title, the background you must know. So let's go on to slide 24 immediately, and we're back in the 18th century with a famous explorer that you all know of. His name is James Cook. This captain was really a courageous man. He traveled everywhere in the world. You can see he went all the way to the North Pole, and he went all the way to the South Pole, and he invested a lot of places that became British. He was not the discoverer of those lands, but he really was part of the development of these colonies. And starting from the First Empire, we saw that in the at the beginning of this presentation. The First Empire in 1763, around this period, he was part of that, and he will develop what will be known today as the White Commonwealth. That is, the territories that are now today with a majority of white people, but who were migrants from Great Britain, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, such as Canada or Australia and New Zealand. Okay, particularly these three are called the White Commonwealth. There are other colonies, but where the majority is not white. This is why it's not called the White Commonwealth. The other aspects we have already mentioned. There were important development in the 18th century, such as the American Revolution. The wars against Napoleon created some, had some consequences on the British Empire. For example, the British took over the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, which was not French, but it was Dutch. But the Dutch had been invaded by Napoleon, and as a consequence, their colonies, the Dutch colonies, had become French possessions. But before the French arrived in the Cape to take the Cape of Good Hope, and if you have a map of the world in mind, you see that the tip of Africa is an important strategic position because it can control the passage from the Atlantic Ocean into the Indian Ocean. So the British sent their fleet in 1806, and they took the Cape from the Dutch who were there, and therefore started a British colony. And South Africa still speak English because it remained a British colony until 1910. So you see, that's one of the consequences of the Napoleonic Wars that we have mentioned a few minutes ago. Of course, all of these places were used as economic places and new markets, so it was very positive, and this is why Britain became very rich during that period. Slide number 26 is also an important one. I already have mentioned that, but I just wanted you to visualize things, that a lot of places that became part of the British Empire were not places that were taken for commercial purposes or for commercial potential. They were taken for strategic reasons. So you can see Malta, you can see Cape Town, you can see Madagascar, and you can see the Strait of Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar, which is still today, that's the first one from the left, and this rock is still British. Sometimes you can be a bit surprised. When I went there many years ago, I wanted to talk to a Bobby because it's an English territory, but he answered to me in Spanish because he was a Spanish-English Bobby. That's for the anecdote. Anyway, Why are these places important? But you see, the Strait of Gibraltar controls the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. So for Britain, it was a way to control what was going on in the Mediterranean Sea, and of course that was very important. For example, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he couldn't come back because the British Navy was in the Mediterranean Sea. And for example, you know of a famous stone that was found by French troops in Egypt called the Rosetta stone, la pierre de Rosette, which helped Champollion to translate the hieroglyphs. So this is why Champollion is very famous in the world. But this stone is in the British Museum now. Why? Because before it arrived in Paris, it was taken by a British vessel, a British boat. Mauritius, as you can see, I said Madagascar. No, it's not. Sorry, it's not Madagascar, which is the map shows in fact Mauritius. It's near La Réunion Island, which is French, but Mauritius is in an island. And of course, you can see that if you go around South Africa and you go into the Indian Ocean, Mauritius is a nice place to stop when you have ships and you need to repair ships or you need fresh water and all that. The Cape, of course, is a good place also to stop, and this is why they took it from the Dutch, who had already started a port there, a harbor. Malta in the Mediterranean Sea. You can see Malta is in between Sicily and Tunisia, and of course, if ships go by, Malta is a good place to stop the ships, and this is why Britain was adamant to have Malta. So this is why many islands or places like Gibraltar and Cape Town were part of the British Empire. This is for strategic reasons. And we have a proof of that with slide number 27, with other islands such as Jamaica, the Caribbean islands, British Guiana, and the Falklands. Now, if you look at the Falklands, this was the year of my baccalaureate, so I can tell you it's a few years ago, but the year of my baccalaureate in 1982, long time ago, the Argentinians, you can see they are at the tip of South America, decided to invade small islands called the Falkland Islands. In French, les îles Malouines. And I took I put the picture that I found on the internet with penguins because that's basically what people said. There are only penguins on the Falkland Islands. It's not totally true. There are a few British troops, maybe a few British farmers, but it's not a very hospitable place. It's really very cold in winter, but it's one of those strategic islands that belong to Britain. And the Argentina junta, that is military government, decided to invade that in order to find some prestige. Of course, they had forgotten one simple thing, that on the other side of the ocean in England, in 10 Downing Street, there was a woman called Margaret Thatcher. You know, she was nicknamed the Iron Lady, la Dame de Fer. And of course, it was absolutely impossible for her to accept that Argentinians take the Falkland Islands, even if there's no petrol on it, there's nothing very important, it's just for the prestige. And so she sent some troops, she sent some, the story goes that she sent the Gurkhas. The Gurkhas are soldiers from Nepal, Nepalese soldiers, which have always been very frightening. They have a knife called the kukri, and the kukri frightens people because the enemy always think that the Gurkhas are going to cut their throat and cut them to pieces just with their kukri. So, of course, they are fierce warriors, they Nepalese soldiers, the Gurkhas, and so she sent the Gurkhas in front of the Argentinian troops, and the story goes that when the Gurkhas arrived in the trenches, there was nobody there because the Argentinians knew the Gurkhas were coming, and they were so frightened that they went away. Anyway, this is for the anecdote once again. And so Britain was able to get the Falkland back this is part of the prestige that Britain wanted to fight. And the American magazine that you have, which cover you have, you see The Empire Strikes Back, and of course it might ring a bell for you, because the empire, of course, is the idea that Britain is still an empire, is going to fight for its empire. So The Empire Strikes Back, but of course it's a reference to George Lucas' film on Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. So of course it's a nice title, and the Falklands crisis is there to explain, and you have this airplane carrier that goes towards Argentina to get it back. So this is an idea that the British Empire has always been has always existed, and one key element we'll see is that the last colony was Hong Kong, and it was given back to China in 1997. So it's quite not too far. It's only 23 years ago that the last of the British colony became not independent, because it was given back to China. Unfortunately, we know that things are not going very well in Hong Kong at the moment. And this is how it started on slide 28. It started because of the Opium War. The situation in China was that there was an opium war that opposed a lot of traders. Opium, as you know, is a drug, but it was very fashionable in England, and therefore it represented a lot of money, and therefore there was this war, it's because of that war that Britain intervened, sent troops from India, not from England. You see, it's quicker to go from India. And this is when they took Hong Kong and Macau, which became English possessions. And as I said, it's only in 1997 that Hong Kong was given back to China after many, many, many years. Now, the blue box is an interesting thing for you to remember. I told you that the power of Britain laid in its navy. The power of the navy is something that has always been important for Britain. And in order to make sure that Britain would still rule the waves, would still be the most important maritime nation in the world, at least at that time, of course. Later it will change, and it's not the case anymore. But in order to remain the biggest nation maritime nation in the world, they had decided that if they could count all the ships from the French Navy, and they would add all those ships to the German Navy, all those the amount of the ships, of the number of ships, had to be half of the British Navy. That is, the British Navy had to be the double in size of the French and German fleets combined. You can see with my little drawing at the bottom what it means. It means, of course, that Britain would be very powerful if France and Germany would become allies against her, because she would still have the double of ships, and therefore would be stronger. This was just an objective in order to feel reassured, because for Britain the navy was very important. Ships had some prestige in British ideology or British mind. And when Queen Elizabeth I had a navy, the ships were made of wood, of course. Now they are made of iron, but they used to be made of wood. And the saying went that the navy was the bulwark of old England. The bulwark means the rampart. The rampart, you understand, because it's close to French. It's the walls that surrounds a city, the bulwark, les remparts, the bulwarks of old England. So you see, symbolically, the ships are the bulwark of the country, because the country is an island. And so if you put ships around the British Isles, then you have a fortified castle, sort of. So this is why ships have always been so important for British people. Now I'd like to go on to my second point in this last part of my lecture. Second B, the empire on which the sun never sets. So we are going to deal properly with the British Empire. Just to show you some maps, in 1815 you can see that you have not a very big empire still yet. From 1763 to 1815 it's not a big change from the previous map, okay? But what is going to be very impressive is the following map on slide number 31 with the red patch, because here you can see in the 20s that the British Empire is really, really gigantic, is really very important. It is the biggest empire that was ever made on the earth. And of course this is something that is part of the British imagination. And I have a colleague in England who works on the empire, but he also works on the Brexit. And he demonstrated that a lot of people, in order to vote for the Brexit, were influenced by the idea that some ideologists said that Britain would find the former glory it had if they got out of Europe. The idea of the empire was behind that. In other way, it was a way to say, let's make Britain great again, to pun an American president who said, let's make America great again. This is the same idea. That is, the nostalgia for the British Empire was obviously present in the debates on the Brexit before the vote took place. And this is obviously why it's important to understand the British Empire if you want to understand modern day Britain. So let's go to slide number 32, and I'd like to start with this opposition that we seem to have regularly because we've seen it mentioned. It's the idea of Little England versus Greater Britain. These concepts are linked to commercial purposes. Not just ideological things or political things, but really commerce. Because the idea is that an empire costs a lot. It costs a lot because if you have a colony, you need to bring everything you need to control the colony. So you need a governor, an official civil servant, un fonctionnaire, civil servant. The governor is there to control and to administer the colony. He needs to have employees, other civil servants who are going to help him. He needs, of course, to have soldiers, because he cannot control and protect his colony if he doesn't have an army. He needs, of course, infrastructures. He needs roads to be made, maybe trains to be developed. He needs ships to go back and forth to the mother country and back to the colony. He needs food, he needs farmers, etc., etc., etc. So you can imagine all that costs a lot of money, and therefore a colony costs a lot. However, of course, the idea is it's an investment. That is, if you give land, for example, to a settler, un colon, a settler, someone who settles, this man is going to produce goods that is going to be able to be sold to the mother country. And of course, it will be for the general benefit of all. And of course, then a colony becomes profitable when the money that comes back from the colony into the mother country is at least equal, if not superior, to the money invested. You understand, this is simple business. Of course, if you put more money than you get out of the colony, then you are not financially balanced. And this is what Adam Smith, you know him, we have spoken about him several times. You have his picture here, his dates, a Scottish economist, the one who promoted liberalism, the laissez-faire policy, the free trade policy, who was against protectionism. He also said that, of course, if you want to keep a colony, it's got to be profitable. If it's not profitable, the colony should be given up, should be abandoned. Okay? Like a bad business. If your business doesn't bring money, you must stop it. Of course, he admitted that for prestige, an empire could be preserved, even if some colonies were not profitable. But as a consequence, there are people who wanted to promote the empire, and they were called, they wanted the promotion of Greater Britain. So Greater Britain, with this comparative, greater Britain means Great Britain with plus the empire. Greater, plus the empire. Little England, of course, on the contrary, is the opposite. It means taking care just of England, not even Ireland or Scotland or Wales, just England. And these are people, of course, who wanted to preserve their money, saying we must invest the money in England for the poor people, for infrastructures and all that, but not about the colonies. So these two ideologies opposed each other and were bones of contention inside the political parties and opposed a lot of elements. We will see that the Irish question will be part of the issue because, for example, someone like Mr. Gladstone will lose elections because he will have lost the opportunity to he promoted home rule for Ireland, and some people rejected that. Some people from his own party, called the Unionist Liberals, they decided to leave the Liberal Party to go to the Conservative Party, who was against home rule in Ireland. So you see, it's a political issue to know whether we keep or not a colony. And this is, of course, part of the international relations and therefore of our program. Richard Cobden, as you can see, the other gentleman who is represented in this slide, he favored the independence of the colonies, and because he considered that Little England was enough worry for the government. Okay, and he said that like Adam Smith, so that an imperial federation could be positive, and this is one of the reflections that preoccupied a lot of politicians, because they listened to Adam Smith saying, if a colony is too expensive, then we mustn't keep it. And you do remember they have a good example of a successful loss of a colony, which is in 1783 the loss of the American colonies. But because they continued to have privileged economic relations with the United States, it became a very positive thing to have the United States as a commercial partner rather than as a colony, with all the problems that unfolds from having a colony. So you see, there's a logic also in not having a colony. And there will be a lot of discussions, and this was at the programme of the Agrégation until last year, the Home Rule question and the Empire. And for example, in 1867, Canada became the first dominion. That is, Canada had a sort of semi-autonomy from the British government. And Australia became autonomous in 1901. South Africa became became a dominion, not completely autonomous, but became a dominion. And South Africa became a dominion in 1910. So you see there are landmarks showing that maybe the British Empire was a bit expensive and maybe it should be given up. You have a quotation in the blue box by Adam Smith. I'll let you read it, of course, and you will be able to understand his point of view on an economic basis, of course. Adam Smith was only interested in economics. Slide 33 is about Mr. Gladstone I mentioned to you, the one who lost some of his members of a political party, the Liberals, who joined the Conservative. It's interesting to know that Gladstone first was a Tory. Now you know what it is. That is a Conservative. When he was a Conservative, he said that England had to protect its colonies. But when he became a Liberal, he was in favor of giving up some colonies, and he did give up some colonies, such as the Transvaal, for example, in South Africa, that became independent. And this is one of the issues that was a problem for his re-election, because losing a colony was seen by the public as something negative. That is, a leader who loses a colony is not a good leader. So obviously this was something that he had not anticipated, of course, but it was his policy. But anyway, you can see he changed his mind first because he was in a Conservative, and then he became a Liberal, but then he wanted to preserve the colonies, and then he wanted to give them up. So you see, of course, people can change their minds, that's normal, but as a politician, of course, this might be a bit risky, and that's what happened to him when he lost some election. Another person, just as an example, Goldwin Smith. He was professor at Oxford. He published a letter in the press stating his position towards colonization. That is, he said it's a waste of public money. So you see, not all British people were imperialists at the time, and because the colonies were very expensive. So you see, it's not on a moral basis that the colonies were fought against, even though there were people against what was being done to the population there. But the majority of the people just said, no, it's public money. I don't want my money to be used and used for the empire. And that's important, because one of the arguments given by government, pro-imperialist government, was that the empire was a protection against enemies. It was not totally untrue, but it was not totally true either. I mean, people could attack England without caring about the empire. The only thing is, of course, during the First World War and Second World War, the empire will participate in the war. And Marseille, for example, will be a very important place who saw French colonial troops arrive, but also British Empire colonial troops arrived. Indians from India arrived in 1914. South African and Australians and New Zealanders arrived in 1916 in Marseille, before they took the train from the Gare Saint-Charles to go to the battlefields. So there are two aspects to it, of course. This debate took place in the 19th century, but it was an important debate. Those who wanted to preserve the empire and those who wanted to get rid of the empire. Now, some people supported the empire for other reasons. Slide 34. Slide 34 shows that there is people who were interested in the empire. First, you can see the churches were glad. You remember, the churches had lost a bit of their parishioners, I would say, with the Industrial Revolution and the exile of countryside people who used to work in agriculture and who went to fetch jobs in the cities, in the industry. And you remember they had to send missionaries into these places in order to evangelize them again, because they had lost all senses of what religion was. They had no religious education because they were lost in a way in slums. And of course, you saw the children working in factories. They would be so tired, and that's one of the texts by Frederick Engels that you had last week. These kids were so tired that they would sleep all day long on Sunday. So of course they didn't have Sunday schools, catechism if you prefer. So the churches were in difficulty, and sending missionaries in England gave them the idea, of course, to send missionaries everywhere in the world with the British Empire. And this was part of the church revival. And the idea that churches had a mission to fulfill, to bring the gospel, les évangiles, the Christian books in the Bible, to the heathen, okay, to the unbelievers. And therefore, in 1838, you had the Colonial Church Society that was developed, and the London Missionary Society. Of course, these people were pro-imperialist because it was an important ground for them to be able to send their missionaries. Another category of people who were happy to go to have an empire were the upper class people. Why? Because because the colonies existed, they gave them an opportunity to give a job to their sons. Why? Because in British law, only the eldest child, and boy particularly, is going to inherit from the father. He will get the title, the peerage, the duke, baron, viscount, or whatever, and he will inherit the land. And his brothers cannot inherit anything except a little bit of money. And so they had to find jobs for the second and third son. Traditionally, the second son would be sent into the army to have a military career, or in the administration, a civil servant. Traditionally, the third one would be sent as a priest of the Anglican Church and would have a parish and would be paid to be a priest. And so this expression, which is by George Cornwall Lewis, the man that you see on the slide, it's that the empire was an outdoor relief for the upper classes, an outdoor relief, outdoor, out of England, okay, and relief, that is, people were relieved because they could send their children in the army as officers, of course. Upper class people could buy a license for their sons to be officers. This is why the expression an officer and a gentleman, this expression comes from here. And of course, the bigger the empire, the more soldiers were needed, and therefore the more officers were needed, and the more sons could go into the army. So the upper classes supported the empire. And finally, a third category of people who were very keen on the empire were workers themselves. Because, of course, with the colonies, they could be tempted to find a new life in a new El Dorado, using the Spanish word for South America, a country of gold, El Dorado. And so these people, particularly when you remember, we mentioned that several times, the Great Famine in Ireland, but also elsewhere, a lot of people went to the colonies to find a better life. So this is, of course, something that people were looking forward if they didn't have enough to live in England. and then, of course, imperialists took the opportunity to show that it was a land of plenty, it was a land of opportunity, that people could become successful. Of course, they didn't talk about diseases and mosquitoes that could kill people, and temperatures that were so different, etc., etc. But it was an opportunity to promote Britishness, and this is obviously the message as it was conveyed. Education and the middle class and the empire. So these are very important elements. Education had always existed in England, of course, but it was an elite education. This education was given in very famous places such as Eton, Harrow, and of course universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. Now, these places were, at the beginning of the 19th century, exclusively made for the elite, the upper class. Now, the middle class started to have a lot of money, and of course, very often they wanted to copy the upper class people. They wanted to be like them. They wanted to be part of that elite. And this is why some of them even bought their peerage. And you can see that very clearly in Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, when you see some nobility from ancestry despising new nobility. The new nobility being people given a peerage because they had done something nice, or because they had enough money to pay for that. And so they despise these new aristocrats who are not for them real aristocrats. They consider themselves as the real aristocrats whose ancestors date back from the Normans of William the Conqueror. So this kind of snobbish attitude, of course, was resented by the middle class, and particularly when schools like Eton and Harrow refused to welcome the sons of the middle class, who did not have the pedigree, I would say. They had the money, but not the pedigree. They didn't belong to families, famous aristocratic, long traditional aristocratic families. So the middle class started its own educational system, and this is why they created their own university. And for example, the University of London was created in 1836, Durham, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Bristol, Nottingham, Reading, all the other universities that still exist today in England, and others, of course, not just Oxford and Cambridge, who were the elite universities. And a lot of secondary schools also were developed for the middle class people. And the middle class people, those Protestants, you remember, the Calvinists, Protestants who created who took profit of the Industrial Revolution to promote the middle class and capitalism, decided that they would promote people through merit and not through birth. It's not because you're an aristocrat that you're going to be a good officer or a good civil servant. And so they started changing in their schools even the curriculum. That is, people were not just going to be educated as gentlemen, but they were going to be educated as efficient men, and particularly businessmen. For example, in the middle class, it was important to learn about economics, and therefore arithmetics and mathematics, not just reading and writing, and not just Greek and Latin, but foreign languages, because if you want to be a trader, you need to speak foreign languages. So obviously you have the feeling perhaps that I'm talking about something very modern. Indeed, the middle class promoted modern education, the education that is still here today, and not just the gentleman's education, which was meant to become a gentleman, not an efficient businessman. And merit, of course, is very democratic, because if you're an efficient man, you can be a successful man. So you see, once again, the spirit of the self-made man that you see in the text of Samuel Smiles' Self-Help was present in those new schools that were invented and constructed by the middle class, by opposition to the upper classes. And I think I mentioned to you this series on Netflix that I think is quite good. It's called The Game, or The English Game, sorry, The English Game. And it's about football players from the working class who face football players from the upper class. And you can see the difference in ideology and the notion of professionalism which comes in it. So it's interesting to see this change. And this change took place in the Victorian era. So if you want to relax but still study Anglophone studies, or do some Anglophone studies, please don't hesitate to watch the English Game. One thing that was developed in the 19th century is the notion of cohesion. In order to have a spirit, and they use the French expression an esprit de corps, that is, to have a unity spirit, and to train the officers to be united with other officers and men, they developed sports such as football and rugby. And this is why sports and empire are closely linked at that time. In those schools such as rugby, of course, where rugby was invented, they developed that spirit. So merit, esprit de corps, and being intelligent and efficient, and of course to have a good, strong body, was at the heart of the self-made man who was going to conquer the British Empire. And at the same time, you can see they created, the middle class created the modern education. If we go to slide number 36, we have a landmark which is interesting, the Great Exhibition. So this was supposed to be one of your lectures, lecture number 3. But, because we started 1 week late, we decided to skip it. But Mr. Calvini-Lefebvre was generous enough to send you the PowerPoint and to send you the audio, and stating you could work on the tutorial too. So you should know a few things about the Great Exhibition. I hope you're going to know things about them. But just to remind you that at that time, the Great Exhibition was a way to exhibit the empire also. The empire was 4 million square kilometers and had more than 150 million subjects. And so it was already something that had to be shown and demonstrated. Slide 37, progress towards the age of empire. I'm just going to go a little bit quicker because you can just read the text. In the 19th century, one of the key elements was Africa. Why? Because South America was already conquered by the Spanish and Portuguese. The American North was already occupied. Australia, Asia, all that was occupied. So Africa was the last continent to be able to be colonized. And it's interesting to see that at the beginning of the 19th century, 1/10 of the African continent was colonized. 1/10, un dixième, was colonized at the beginning of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, 9/10 of the African continent was colonized. And you can see all the countries that were colonizing Africa. You have, of course, France, Britain, but also Belgium, Germany, Portugal, the Netherlands, etc., etc. So I just read the text, and I'm going to skip to my slide number 38. And slide 38 is about India. And just to remind you that India became the jewel of the crown that is le joyau de la couronne, that is the most beautiful, not the biggest, but the most beautiful colony, because of course it had this mythical aura of the land of the Maharajas, and of gold and diamonds and with elephants and all that. So the idea was to develop this colony, and they did it, but little by little, either making alliances with some Maharajas, because there were princes everywhere. There was not one king of India. And of course, the idea was to gain colonies and not to lose colonies, as I already said about Mr. Gladstone. So Mr. Gladstone had difficulties when he lost some of the colonies. I can't talk about the British Empire without talking about the Indian Mutiny in slide 39. The Indian Mutiny took place in 1857. A lot of English civilians were killed by mutinies in the British Army, who were all Indians. The story goes as they were Muslim soldiers, and they had to open the cartridge with their mouth and put the powder into the rifle. But unfortunately, as the story goes, that the cartridge were protected by beef grease. And of course, putting the cartridge to the mouth would mean have the grease of the beef in the mouth, and for a Muslim, it's not possible. And therefore, not a beef, sorry, a pig, a pig. And for a Muslim, it's not possible to have a pig or pork in the mouth. And so this is the story goes how there was an Indian mutiny against Europeans, and particularly British. It became a sort of revolution in the northern part of India. And of course it was a terrible thing, because a lot of civilians, women and children, were killed, and as a consequence, the British were very, very cruel to the mutinies. And when they sent the troops, and particularly the Gurkhas, I mentioned the Gurkhas, were able to stay. They remained faithful to the British crown, and they attacked the mutinies, and they were able to defeat the mutinies, who were then killed, like, for example, being put in front of a cannon, and the cannon would be shot so that people would explode. You see, this is very cruel from the British nation, but it shows how angry and the terrible shock that had been this Indian mutiny. So the Indian mutiny is part of the British Empire. I wanted you to mention, to have a note of it. Slide number 40 is about Queen Victoria. She was crowned Empress of India, and you can see the tiles, that you can see the window tiles, the stained glass window that you can see at the bottom. They are in Grasse, in fact, not far from here, on the French Riviera. And you see it says Her Majesty the Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India, 1891. This is when she went to Grasse. And so Empress of India is a title that was added to her by Benjamin Disraeli, who is mocked here as a sort of Oriental person bringing the crown to Queen Victoria. This is also a way to promote the empire, because she's Empress of India and not just Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. Okay, so it gives more prestige to Queen Victoria. This prestige, we can see it here in the iconographic documents, the mother of her people. You can see that Queen Victoria, you can see pictures where she has Indian servants with her. You can see an ad about an oven, and you can see that Queen Victoria is bringing civilization to her people. And so obviously it's just a commercial, an ad, but Queen Victoria here is promoting some English products, and of course they represent civilization. Here, Queen Victoria, the mother of her people, is not just the mother of English people, but of course mother of people of the earth, because she became Empress of India. And so the whole iconographic documents, all the iconographic documents are always very often represent her as a queen of the world. Slide 42, Empire and Popular Culture. So just to show you that the empire was promoted through culture. This drawing is nice, is interesting. Civilization by opposition to barbarism. That is, the savages against the civilized people. You can see Britannia holding the flag, and of course the modern weapons killing the savages who just have swords. So of course this is part of course there is social Darwinism. Now you know what it is, and of course you know exactly how the imperial project was promoted through social Darwinism, the lesser people, and bringing civilization to the heathen, including religion, as we saw, was part of the imperial project. Some examples of this promotion of the empire, so you'll just have a look. There are books, there are games, there are photographies, there are song sheets, there are boys' magazines. A lot of people were subjected to the empire, and therefore the empire was promoted. And of course it was a fashionable thing, so people would buy the products because they were fashionable. Slide 44. You see also a teapot, you see a tea caddy, that is a box where you put a tea, such as by Lipton. You see coffee with the empire, colonial crackers, you see a pipe, and you see cards that were collected by boys from chocolate boxes or elsewhere. You can see that every item of everyday life could be subjected to the empire. And another aspect, of course, which triggered the interest for the empire were the geographical discoveries, particularly exploring the Dark Continent. You had heroes, British heroes, who became famous because, for example, they wanted to find the sources of the Nile. It was an episode that took many years to find the sources of the Nile. The Nile, you know, the Egyptian river. And you have people such as Grant and Speck, who became famous because they tracked the origin of the sources of the Nile. It was not an easy business, particularly at that time. Another famous explorer and also missionary, David Livingstone, who was the first European to discover the Victoria Falls in today's Zimbabwe. And the Royal Geographic Society was something that really promoted these discoveries. They funded expedition. When they came back, the explorers had to make a conference in London where hundreds of people would come. Books would be sold. David Livingstone's book on the travels in Africa became a bestseller. So you see, the empire and the discovery of the world became something very fashionable. An episode which was really illustrated is when Livingstone was in a little village in Africa and hadn't given news for a year because of course there was no telephone, no smartphones, nothing, and he had been ill. That's one of the reasons. And so Stanley, a very famous Welsh explorer, you can see him with his rifle and drawings. He went to see him, and the story is of course very nice, because when he met him, instead of saying I'm glad to see you, he was very aristocratic and he said, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Of course, this is quite odd in the middle of Africa to be so polished and so to be so refined. But this is how the story goes, and the finding of Livingstone became a key element of the imagery of the British Empire. nearly finished. Charles Gordon I mentioned, because we remember he is the one who gave the date to the beginning of this to this lecture. Charles Gordon, General Charles Gordon, he was killed in Khartoum by Muslim troops of the Mahdi, and Khartoum was taken by the Mahdi until it was taken over by the English years later by Lord Kitchener, you know, the one with the big moustache. It's also the time when the Suez Canal was built, which enabled ships to go from the Mediterranean Sea into the Red Sea and therefore into the Indian Ocean. So it was a really an important landmark, because it enabled ships not to go around Africa in order to go into India. So these, of course, are linked to new technologies, new discoveries, exploration and business routes, you see, go along. Martyrs are made. Charles Gordon should have left before Khartoum. He didn't obey the government, who had told him to go away. He had decided to stay, and he died. So we might say it's too bad for him. So you see, it's also the time when people were ready to die to become famous. He did become famous, but because he died. So this is how the empire became a very important element. And just before my conclusion, one slide, and then it's finished. The Scramble for Africa, which was the name for La Ruée sur l'Afrique, if you prefer, is something that has been very shocking for a lot of African countries. It's because the danger was that European countries could fight for one territory. In order to avoid that, there was the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, where European countries, as you can see on the cartoon, decided to cut the cake of Africa and to give pieces to every member of this European gathering. Of course, it's quite shocking today to see that Europeans decided to agree on the colonization of Africa, but the idea was to avoid fighting between Europeans. Of course, it won't stop them from killing each other in the 20th century, but still, this is it happened in Berlin in 1884, 1885. It's a very important date for the colonization process. And to conclude, my last slide, I've just got 3 or 4 minutes left. The idea that the empire was no end of a lesson. And who said that there was no end of a lesson? It's Rudyard Kipling, you know, the famous father of Mowgli and the Jungle Book. He was also a poet, and he was also he wrote a lot about the imperial process. So you have an extract from this poem. We have no end of a lesson. We will do us no end of good. It was our fault, and our very great fault, and that we must turn it to use. We have 40 million resources for failure, but not a single excuse. So the more we work and the less we talk, the better results we shall get. We have had an imperial lesson. It may make us an empire yet. So the idea is that the lesson was given by the men that you can see with the rifles. In South Africa, you can see the map. In the Orange republics, they were called Boer people. They were from Dutch, French, and German origin. A lot of French people, South African people are called Dutoit, Duplessis, Malan, Malherbe, Joubert, Leroux, etc. They are French Protestants who migrated after the repealing of the Edict of Nantes. So they went to South Africa, and they became part of the population called the Afrikaners. At that time, they were called Boer, B-O-E-R, and the Anglo-Boer War was, I don't know why there is an S, it's Anglo-Boer War, sorry, in South Africa, saw the victory of the British troops, but with a lot of resistance from these Boer farmers. And therefore, this poem is a good conclusion, no end of a lesson, because when Queen Victoria died in 1901, her son Edward VII understood that the tide was turned and that Britain needed strong allies, which led him to sign the Entente Cordiale in 1904 with France and Russia. Ah, that's funny. Remember, France and Russia were the enemies of Britain. Now France, Russia, and England and Britain become allies. And you remember on the other side, Turkey, Germany, and Austria. And they were called the Triplice. So the Entente Cordiale and the Triplice were already ready to fight each other at the beginning of the 20th century. And this will lead, of course, to the First World War. So you see, the empire, the big British Empire, was also an opportunity for Britain to understand that maybe they were not that strong anymore and they needed strong allies such as France and Russia. And you know that since 1904, France and Britain have been allies. But this is another story that you will discover with Mr. Graves and Madame André. This is the end of our 6 lectures on the 19th century. I hope you have enjoyed them. Please, before the tutorial, read the PowerPoint, listen to the audio, and make sure that you understand everything before you start working on the 20th century. Because, well, you need all these elements to understand the 20th century. Thank you for listening and take care. Bye-bye.